It's my pleasure to introduce a citizen of the world who also is a significant presence in the life of this community, this state, and this nation, Ambassador Barbara Barrett. She has played a significant role not only in the early stages of O'Connor House. She was even the one that got the movement underway that had the O'Connor House moved over to its beautiful present location. And she has played a major role in bringing some of the distinguished speakers to our presence. So she is tireless around the world all the time, but with us in all the major things that we think are important in Arizona. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Barbara Barrett.
Good afternoon. There's an Afrikaans phrase, Ubuntu, which translates to, I am because we are. I am because we are. The more we come together, the more we collaborate and work for common goals, the more we multiply our chances for success. Our speaker today is one who has brought people together to multiply the chances for success. My job is to introduce the introducer. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about someone who is a great leader, who's demonstrated wisdom and courage in leadership. That is the United States Senator Jeff Flake. Now you know of him as a longtime congressman, as a think tank leader, as someone who has danced to his own drummer, someone who thinks things through in his own way and isn't bound by tradition, someone who, even on a deserted isle in the middle of the Pacific, can get along for a week. But you may not know that Senator Jeff Flake did his Latter-day Saints mission in South Africa and Namibia, and in the region from which our keynote speaker today hails. So here to take some of that Afrikaans that he speaks fluently, and to develop from that an understanding of the extraordinary leadership of President F.W. De Klerk. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Senator Jeff Flake.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be introduced by one of my favorite people in the whole world, Barbara Barrett. And to be here at the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute is just a particular honor for me. If you'll just indulge me for a second. Ik het nooit gedacht dat hierdie plaasjappie van Snowflake zou staan met de voormalige president van Zuid-Afrika. Niet in mijn wildste dromen. Het is zo lekker om iemand te vinden wat mijn taal kan verstaan. So I just said I had never thought that this farm boy from Snowflake would stand with the former president of South Africa. Not in my wildest dreams. It's so nice to find someone who speaks my language. My kids and my wife are tired of hearing it. So, I've had a love affair with Africa that has spanned a lifetime. It started when I was just a young boy, and a man from Southern Africa came to our home and was telling us that he used to fly his plane so low that the giraffes would look down on him. Now, whether or not the story was true was immaterial to me. I was hooked. But I later, as Barbara mentioned, was called as a Mormon missionary to South Africa and Zimbabwe in the early 1980s. This was when the policy of apartheid was in full swing. I would have never dreamed that South Africa would be transformed just a few years later. In 1989, my wife Cheryl, who's here today, and I returned to Southern Africa, this time to spend a year running a political foundation in the country of Namibia, monitoring that country's independence. To be there when a country like Namibia has its first elections and writes its constitution, that's nirvana to a political junkie like me. But from Namibia, we had a front row seat, to watch South Africa go through its transition and to watch F.W. De Klerk in action. In this unforgettable speech opening Parliament on February 2nd of 1990, our guest today said the following: "History has thrust upon the leadership of this country the tremendous responsibility to turn our country away from its present direction of conflict and confrontation." And that he did. Nelson Mandela, the man whose release from prison was announced in that same speech, said the following about our guest: "He had the courage to admit that the terrible wrong that had been done to our country and its people through the imposition of the system of apartheid. He had the foresight to understand and accept that all the people of South Africa must, through negotiations and as equal participants in the process, together determine what they want to make of their future." F.W. De Klerk has been honored by so many groups and organizations and institutions that we'd be here all afternoon if I would name them, so I'll just mention one of them. Along with Nelson Mandela, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. I think all of us would make a place for our mantle for that award. But since his retirement from politics, he's kept extremely busy, especially with the F.W. De Klerk Foundation, which he founded in 1999. Just last month, the foundation launched its Center for Unity in Diversity. That's something, after we hear the debate tonight, we'll all agree we probably could use a little more of. But on a personal note, I should mention that just 2 weeks ago, Cheryl and I dropped off our son Tanner at the airport as he flew to South Africa to begin his Mormon mission in South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. This love affair that Cheryl and I have with Africa is now rooted in the next generation. So, saam met my, gee jou grootste welkom to die eerbare F.W. De Klerk. Please give your greatest welcome to President De Klerk.
Thank you very much. Madam Justice, Governor Ducey, Senator Flake, Ambassador Barrett, distinguished guests. Thank you for inviting me here today and for the opportunity for me and my wife to meet so many distinguished members of the Arizona community. It is a great honor and pleasure to meet you, Madam Justice, as someone who has served your country with such wonderful dedication and distinction in all three branches of government. It is also a great pleasure and honor for me to be here today as a guest at the institute that you founded, where I know that I am amongst like-minded people who share your vision that it is possible to solve important social, economic, and political problems through civil discussion and civic action. That is what I also firmly believe, and that is what I have always tried to practice. It is possible, and it does work. I'm also grateful to the Arizona State University, to the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and to the Claremont Lincoln University for their most generous support in making today's event possible. I will be addressing you today on the topic, Developing World, Developing Leaders. This is not simply an academic question. One thing that we have learned since the beginning of the millennium is that globalization means that none of us can ignore developments even in the most remote societies. Who would ever have thought 20 years ago that Islamic fundamentalists living in the remote mountains of Afghanistan could possibly have any impact on the United States or on the world's global business and financial hub, in New York. Who would have imagined that a disease that was incubated in the jungles of Central Africa could possibly destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands of people here in America, and that it would lead to the deaths of more than 4 million people in my own country, South Africa. Who would have dreamt that technological developments on the west coast of the United States would revolutionize the way China processes information, or the manner in which peasants in Kenya communicate and carry out their financial transactions on their mobile phones. Globalization, ladies and gentlemen, means that none of us can ignore the factors that promote or undermine stability and progress anywhere in the world. Globalization is making the world smaller. Everywhere people are on the move, seeking access to the better lives, security and freedom that they see on the internet. The dominant image of our times may well be the hundreds of thousands of people crossing the Mediterranean and scaling the border fences in Ceuta and along the Mexican border. All this means that people in the developed world must become much more aware of the factors that are making it increasingly difficult for millions of people in developing countries to remain where they are. Why are some of these societies failing to create a better life for their people, while others are succeeding? One of these factors is the quality of leadership in the more than 120 countries that have emerged onto the global stage since the Second World War. Following the disintegration of the European colonial empires and the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the measures of the success of these emerging societies is the degree to which they have been able to develop and sustain genuine democratic systems. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is generally a high correlation between economic and political freedom and success in a number of areas of human development and human endeavor. However, democratization has delivered a pretty mixed bag. According to Freedom House, the world's most authoritative monitor of political and civil freedoms around the globe, of the 120 countries that have become independent since World War II, only 41 are free. 40 are partly free, and 39 are not free at all. It is also instructive to note where these countries are. Well over half of the 41 free countries, 24 of them are islands in the Caribbean, around Africa, and in the Pacific Ocean. So democracy does very well in small island states, perhaps because the populations tend to be homogeneous and because politicians do not have the space to become detached from their supporters. All of the Soviet Union's former satellite states in Eastern Europe are free, while with the exception of the Baltic states, there is not a single free country among the states that used to comprise the Soviet Union. Only 9 of the emerging states in Africa are free, but this is much better than the situation in Asia, where only one of the emerging states, India, is fully democratic. Undoubtedly, one of the critical factors determining the success of emerging states is the quality of their leadership. Leaders of newly independent states face many challenges that their counterparts in well-established democracies do not really experience and quite often do not really understand. Firstly, there is the continuing liberation syndrome. Many leaders of newly independent states emerged from revolutionary movements that were good at fighting liberation wars, but had very little conception of the humdrum challenges of day-to-day governance. In South Africa, our present governing party, the African National Congress, still regards itself as a national liberation movement with an unfulfilled historic mandate and not as an ordinary political party. Secondly, many leaders of post-independence governance fell into the ideological trap of radical socialism. Emerging leaders, many of them trained in the old Soviet Union, were inspired by the ideals of the classless society and the abolition of private property. They regarded Mao and Che Guevara as their role models and were surprised when their economies inevitably collapsed. Thirdly, most leaders of newly independent countries have had to contend with divisive ethnic forces. Most of their newly independent countries were artificial creations of European imperialists who drew borders on the colonial maps with little or no consideration for the peoples that they were artificially dividing or lumping together in the same states. Too often, emerging leaders tended to favor people from their own ethnic group and to alienate those from other communities. And finally, there was the ever-present threat of corruption. In states without strong civil society institutions and well-established traditions of probity, there was always the temptation to use power to advance the political and economic interests of the leader, his family, and his friends. Power did corrupt, and absolute power tended too often to corrupt absolutely. The sad reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that history is more often driven by bad than good leadership. History is replete with examples of leaders who have consistently taken the wrong decisions. Had Charles I, Louis XVI, and Nicholas II been better leaders, the history of their countries would have been fundamentally different. Just consider the stupidity of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the folly of the Europeans in precipitating the First World War, and in our own time, the disastrous consequences of the Second Gulf War. So what then are the qualities of good leadership? And how can we promote these qualities in the present generation of leaders in developing countries? What, at the age of 80, have I learned from my experience of leadership? Firstly, I have learned about the corrosive nature of power. Lord Acton was right. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The problem in South Africa before 1994 was that the White Parliament was supreme. It could and did make any law that it pleased. There were no checks and balances and no external controls. It is also true that in the absence of deeply ingrained values and strong and independent watchdogs, those who have power will tend to abuse it to promote their personal and political interests. That is why it is so important to limit and monitor the power of governments and political leaders. Secondly, I have learned that the worst episodes of human history has been caused by ideologies. Just think of the 120 million victims of Nazism, fascism, and communism during the past century. Ideologists develop theories about how to achieve an ideal society and then try to force reality into the narrow channel of their theories. They are all inspired by millenarian visions, the classless society, manifest destiny, or the 1,000-year Reich. They all conjure up enemies, whether it be the liberals, the bourgeoisie, even the Jews. They all ignore realities that do not fit in with their theories. They all trample on the interests of ordinary people in order to achieve their goals. South Africa suffered under the ideologies of apartheid and separate development. And I, who supported it as a young man, have made a profound apology, admitted the wrongness of apartheid, apologized for the pain and the devastation that it has caused to millions of people. But we went further in South Africa. We didn't only apologize. It was my privilege that under my presidency, we abandoned apartheid. We cleared the statute book of all. Thank you. We cleared the statute book of all forms of discrimination. And the last one was we accepted a new constitution, which brought justice to all South Africans and hope and opportunity to all South Africans. I could not have done that without Nelson Mandela on the other side of the table. So, ideology is extremely dangerous. Thirdly, I have learned that it is much easier to reach agreement on the future than on the past. I strongly supported South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but unfortunately it did not succeed in promoting reconciliation. Its greatest flaw was that it was not representative. There were no commissioners on this commission who could speak for the National Party or the Inkatha Freedom Party, two of the three main parties to the conflict. Reconciliation cannot occur if there is no consensus, and consensus is not possible if all sides are not properly represented in whatever investigations take place, in whatever discussions take place, in whatever negotiations take place. Our inability in South Africa to reach agreement about the past has been one of the greatest failures of our post-conflict society. The past still intervenes like an unseen barrier in virtually all our national discourses and provides the fuel for continuing recrimination, guilt, and polarization. As George Orwell observed, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Fourthly, I have learned that the key to harmonious relations in multicultural societies is respect for diversity beneath an overarching umbrella of common values and common loyalties. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, but in multicultural societies one needs both this umbrella of common values and common loyalties, but also, on the other hand, the reality of the diversity and accepting and accommodating each of the components of the diversity as a valued and valuable building block of the greater whole. A United Nations Development Programme report published in 2004 affirmed that cultural liberty was a vital part of human development. If handled well, it could lead to greater cultural diversity and enrich people's lives. However, if it was mismanaged, it could, and I quote from the report, quickly become one of the greatest sources of instability within states and between them. The answer was, and again I quote, to respect diversity and build unity through common bonds of humanity. The UNDP report recommended that states should promote cultural liberty as a human right and as an important aspect of human development. It is only within such a framework that all of us who live in multicultural societies can achieve our full potential as human beings. And we must realize that with globalization, all countries are becoming more and more multicultural. And less you find countries which are homogeneous within itself. You are experiencing it in America. We are experiencing it in South Africa. We have about 5 million illegal immigrants in South Africa, coming from Zimbabwe and coming from other parts of Africa, as far north as the Congo, Nigeria, and Sudan. It's not a funny thing to hear French spoken on the streets of Cape Town. And you are experiencing the inflow of immigrants, legal and illegal. And your society is becoming more and more multicultural. And one of the great challenges of this millennium and of this century in which we now find ourselves is to manage diversity in a constructive way so that it does not become a destructive and destabilizing force. And then fifthly, I've learned the enormous value of political and economic freedom under a system of caring and humane law. Freedom, ladies and gentlemen, is crucial to the happiness, the success, and prosperity of societies everywhere. The top 20% of countries that best promote economic freedom have per capita incomes 7 times greater than the bottom 20%. They are also more equal. Their average GINI index, where 0 represents perfect equality and 100 represents absolute inequality. In the developed countries, the Gini is 34,4 compared to 42,9 for the bottom 20%. Their economies grow faster. Between 1990 and 2009, nations in the top quartile grew by 3% compared with only 1.2% for the bottom quartile. Also, they live longer. In the top 20% to an average age of 79.9 years in free economies, compared to only 60.7 for the bottom quartile. This should come as no surprise. Freedom means empowerment. It empowers the individuals, it empowers companies and associations of which society is composed. Freedom encourages the freedom of debate and research that is the foundation of all innovation. By so doing, it gives free societies an enormous competitive advantage. Freedom means empowerment. So what advice would I give to developing leaders in the developing world? The following: vigilantly limit the power of those who are invested with political, bureaucratic, and economic authority. Limit their power. Secondly, distrust ideologists and all those who base their policies on merely beliefs rather than on realities and experience. Thirdly, accommodate and respect cultural, linguistic, religious, and political diversity. And then base one's outlook on a shared future rather than on a divided past. And lastly, ensure that government promotes maximum freedom within the law for ordinary people to pursue their legitimate personal, economic, and political interests, because freedom is empowerment. But how, ladies and gentlemen, can we in practice convey these messages and others that you might add to leaders struggling with the complex challenges of developing countries? This is exactly the mission of the Global Leadership Foundation, which I founded 12 years ago. We have put together a panel of more than 40 former presidents, prime ministers, and statesmen from countries all over the world. As former leaders, we understand the excruciating challenges with which new generations of leaders must wrestle. We understand the loneliness of leadership. We have experienced the difficulty of obtaining well-based, disinterested, objective advice. We know that many of our closest allies and advisors have their own agendas and filter the information that they pass up to us, and that we need access to all the information. It is for these reasons that we make our advice available to leaders who are dealing with transitional problems. We do so with the utmost discretion, since the last thing that a leader wants is to create the impression that he needs external advice. So we are discreet and we operate somewhat beneath the radar. We put together teams from our panel comprising former leaders who understand the region involved and who themselves have dealt with similar economic, developmental, and political challenges. We don't seek publicity. We only want to help. And we are finding increasingly that this approach resonates with leaders in developing countries. We have no illusions. The task is never easy. But if we can help leaders to avoid catastrophic decisions, if we can share our experiences of success and failure, if we can nudge policy in the right direction with tried and tested experience, then I believe that we will indeed have made a contribution to developing leaders in the developing world, to better governance, and therefore to greater stability, greater economic growth, and greater prosperity for a greater number of people. Ladies and gentlemen, as we enjoy this sumptuous, wonderful lunch, 1/3 of the world population are living in destitution. And they're not happy to be where they are. That lies at the bottom of migration. Either fear, either repression, or hunger and poverty are driving people. To resolve this, we need to go to where the problems are. And we need to do so with aid, yes, but we also need to do it through investment, through contact, through influencing decision makers there, through building better leadership there where the destitution exists. America has a leading role to play in this because it is the leading country of the world. And therefore, it is my hope that America will continue, as it has done in the past, to lead through example, to lead through lending a helping hand where it is necessary, and to adapt also to a new world with new challenges. It was great speaking to you today, meeting so many of you, and great hearing my mother tongue Afrikaans from a senator from Arizona. So I'll end in Afrikaans by saying, baie dankie, dit was 'n heerlike geleentheid en alles van die beste vir almal van u.